Welcome back to another episode of TDNY. This day, not year. The podcast that looks back at the history of the week ahead. If you've tuned in before, you know what you're in for. But if this is your first time listening, first off, hello. I'm your host, Adam. And while I have no qualifications to be talking about history, I do enjoy interesting and unusual historical stories. And, fortunately for you lucky listeners, I also have a microphone to talk about them. Each episode will cover the 7 days of the coming week and a historical story that took place on each day, as well as ending each story off with a song pairing, and then ending the whole episode on a quiz, with one question taken from each story. So pay attention. But enough preamble. This week we'll be learning if an anti-rock of pure antimatter collided with Earth, why you shouldn't take candy from strangers, a traditional shipwreck delicacy, and how flying can be so scary, plus a whole lot more along the way. So, let's dive right in with Monday, June 30th. On this day, not year, space became the ultimate lumberjack. Have you ever read the science fiction book Rendezvous with Rime, written by Arthur C. Clarke? If you wait a few more years, you may be able to see it in cinemas instead. But that's getting away from my point. The book opens with the lines, "Sooner or later, it was bound to happen. On 30th of June, 1908, Moscow escaped destruction by 3 hours and 4,000 kilometers, a margin invisibly small by the standards of the universe." While this is true, the narrow miss is also something that went largely unnoticed by most people in Russia. Despite the cause being missed, the symptoms weren't, and were even picked up all the way in the United Kingdom. To quote an article from the Register newspaper, "Many people who had noticed a peculiar light in the northern sky during the evening remained out of bed and were well rewarded. The sky became light and blue, as if the dawn were breaking, and clouds were illuminated by a pink twinge, the light being so bright that people were able to read newspapers out of doors in London. Barometers, instruments that measure air pressure, went through a succession of 4 undulations, which at the time was for an unknown reason, but the shockwave from the event was powerful enough to travel around the world at least twice. Seismic activity was detected across Europe, and the view of the night sky across America dimmed. So, what caused all this? Well, that's the question. On June 30th, 1908, a little after 7:07 a.m., a bright object was moving across the morning sky. One witness reported it as so bright it made the sun appear black by comparison. This bright object, over the next 10 minutes, would grow closer and closer, glowing in what was described as a bluish white. Finally, at 7:17 a.m., it fell, just over the horizon from observers, and detonated. The explosion was so fierce that dust and water vapor were shot high into the atmosphere, resulting in the early morning light in England and the darkened night sky in America. Here are a few accounts from various sources, first-hand accounts, newspapers of the day, articles from decades later, etc., of the detonation. "Gusts of wind swept the steeps so powerfully that horses were knocked down 400 miles away. The earth began to move and rock. The wind hit our hut and knocked it over. Then I saw a wonder. Trees were falling. The branches were on fire. It became mighty bright." Shock waves from the impact were so violent that an engine driver 560 kilometers away on the Trans-Siberian Railway thought his engine had exploded. At the nearest settlement, 50 miles away, 2 farmers were knocked down by the blast of the meteorite's fall and scorched by the heat. In one herdsman's storage hut, everything had been burned, including his clothing and his samovar, a proto-Russian kettle, as well as his silverware had melted. The split in the sky grew larger, and the entire northern side was covered with fire. At that moment, I became so hot that I couldn't bear it, as if my shirt was on fire. Then, nothing. Nobody went to investigate. No scientists, no locals, and with nomadic tribesmen fearing it had been a display from their thunder god, Agda, they dared not venture to the source. For the next 19 years, through a Russian Revolution and a World War, the cause of this destruction remained a mystery, uninvestigated. That changed with Leonid Alexeyevich Kulik, Soviet mineralogist. He had heard of the events of June 30th, 1908, on a previous expedition, and was sure a meteorite had crashed down in the remote Siberian wilderness. He convinced the government to sponsor an exploratory trip to find the resource-rich rock, and in 1927 he was off on the hunt for it. To save on time, we'll skim over Kulik's travels, but to sum up, with the help of some natives, he eventually found the impact site. Or at least what looked like the impact site. An area calculated at 2,150 square kilometers, or 830 square miles, of the heavily forested wilderness had been flattened. Trees were toppled over in a uniform way, having been blown over like dominoes in the 1908 event. A number that gets thrown around a lot is that 80 million trees were toppled. But a 2021 article by Boslow and Bruno show that this number was based on an incorrect initial assumption that had been repeated through enough sources that now even the NASA website stated it as fact. At the center of the toppled trees, Kulik expected to find a crater and the remains of the suspected meteorite. Instead, he just found more trees. Only these were standing. Their branches were shorn off. They showed signs of destruction and fire, but they still stood. Outside the circle, the forest for kilometers around had been blown down. This should be the impact site, but Kulik was perplexed, as there was no meteorite and no crater. Unfortunately, he would never get to solve this particular problem, despite several expeditions to the area, as World War II broke out, and he went to serve, an act that would cost his life. For years, the leading theory suggested that the Tunguska event, as it came to be known, was caused by a comet, its icy body providing the perfect material to heat up and explode with pressure from entering the atmosphere, the remaining ice melting away in the years before the area was surveyed. Now, many have pointed to the abundant rocky debris left behind that would indicate an asteroid airburst. You may remember, we've covered airbursts before, with the Chelyabinsk airburst of 2013 in Episode 5, in which I stated, as the meteor enters the atmosphere, it compresses and heats up the air and molecules in front of it. This is called ram pressure. Once this reaches a critical point, the meteor can't keep up with the ram pressure applied to it, and something has to give. This resulting give generates enormous heat and pressure, which blasts out around it. Technically, the cause of the explosion is still a mystery, and with any mystery it gives ground to the supernatural, or in this case, extraterrestrial. The following comes from a book I've had for decades and probably contributed to many alien-themed nightmares as a kid. Amazing UFOs and Aliens by Rupert Matthews. In it, a story titled The Fireball loosely details the Tunguska event, that diverts heavily by stating of the explosion, "Some thought it had been a UFO. If UFOs were powered by atomic means, a crash might well have caused the Siberian blast. Many enthusiasts who study UFOs believed this is what happened in Siberia, and many scientists were inclined to agree. Detonating UFOs, or UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena, as they are called now, aren't the only out-there theories." In 1973, two physicists had a new theory on what caused the damage. A black hole. Smaller than a grain of dust, travelling some 25,000 miles or 40,000 kilometres per hour, that had just passed through the Earth, plunging into Siberia and exiting in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean, leaving destruction in its wake. Others posited that it was a meteorite made of antimatter, dubbed an anti-rock, and had exploded on contact with the matter-rich atmosphere. Although, odds are, much like the gunpowder factory of Wangongchang, the simplest answer is probably the correct one. In this case, it was very likely an asteroid about 130 feet or 40 meters wide, travelling just shy of 100,000 kilometers or 62,000 miles per hour, exploding in an airburst 10 kilometers or 6 miles above the ground. It's estimated the blast was around 12 megatons, or 12 million tons of TNT. The bomb that dropped in Hiroshima, for comparison, was 16 kilotons, or 16,000 tons of TNT, a good 750 times weaker. We're just lucky that this event happened over a largely uninhabited area. But, as stated in Rendezvous with Rama, sooner or later it is bound to happen. I cut down trees. I skip and jump. I like to press wildflowers. My song pairing, for those who haven't now got this playing in their heads, is the Lumberjack song by Monty Python. While I very much doubt the asteroid puts on women's clothing and hangs around in bars, it certainly proved to be the most efficient lumberjack in recent times. Tuesday, July 1st. On this day, not year, criminals tried something new. Christian K. Ross lived in Germantown, in northwest Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, on East Washington Lane. He owned and worked at a dry goods store at 304 Market Street, making a rather modest living. It was enough for a large 2-story house and several staff around the home. The large house wasn't just for show. It was home to his family, wife Sarah, and 7 children, Stoughton, Harry, Sophia, Walter, Charlie, Marion, and Annie. While the Rosses' financial situation had taken a hit the year prior, in the 1873 Long Depression, they were still getting by. In fact, Sarah and Sophia had just gone on a holiday to the New Jersey seaside, and Christian was in the process of bringing some sand back home for the remaining kids. July 4th was only 3 days away, and he had promised they could play with some fireworks, from the fireproof safety of a sandpit. Getting home on the evening of July 1st, 1874, the large house seemed too quiet. His wife and eldest daughter were on holiday, his 2 eldest sons were off visiting their grandparents, and his 2 youngest daughters were being looked after by the staff. But it was strange for Charlie, 4, and Walter, 5, to have been so quiet. They had been asking Christian to go get fireworks every chance they had. The only thing that had diverted their attention recently had been the friendly salesman who had handed candy to the children the few times they had been travelling by the house on their wagon. An hour passed, and the boys still hadn't made themselves known. Another hour, and the staff was sent door to door, to the houses of the other children in the neighbourhood who Charlie and Walter would play with. None had seen them. It wasn't until another neighbour, Miss Kidder, called out to Christian and asked if the boys were likely to ride off with strangers. It's likely, Christian supposed, as Miss Kidder recounted overhearing the boys talking to two men in a wagon earlier. Christian was about to rush off to the police when coming down the road towards him were two figures. One was Walter, and the other, a man he had never seen before. The man explained Walter had been found outside a fireworks store, in tears. Christian asked where Charlie was, to which Walter replied, "Why, he is all right. He is in the wagon." Walter recounted how the two salesmen who had given the boys candy over the previous week had stopped by that day too. After a brief chat, they offered to take the boys on a ride to purchase fireworks. After a long ride, they let Walter off to go into the store. But when he came out, the two men, and Charlie, were gone. That evening, Charlie didn't return home. Nor did he return on the 2nd of July. By the 3rd, Christian had put out a missing persons notice in a newspaper, not using Charlie's name, so Sarah wouldn't worry if she saw it. There had still been no trace of Charlie, despite Christian, his brother-in-law, his nephew, the police, and Walter turning the city upside down. Finally, on the 4th of July, they received a letter. It confirmed Christian's worst fears. "Mr. Ross, be not uneasy. You son, Charlie Brewster, be all writ. We has got him, and no powers on earth can deliver out of our hand. You will have to pay us before you get him from us, and pay us a big cent too. If you put the cops hunting for him, you is only defeating your own end. We has got him put, so no living power can get him from us alive. If any approach is made to his hiding place, that is the signal for his instant annihilation." The letter ended, stating he would hear from them again soon. And he did. The next letter arrived July 6th, and contained within it a ransom demand. As sad as this is something you probably expected to hear about as you listened along. But back in 1874, it was unheard of. This was the first kidnapping for ransom case in America. The kidnappers had sent their demands, $20,000. This was an incredible amount of money, worth around $500,000 today. And while the Rosses appeared well off, this was an amount beyond their means to pay. This new letter ended, "When you get ready to business with us, advertise the following in Ledger Personals. Ross, we be ready to negotiate. We look for you answer in Ledger." The following months saw the strangest pen-pal letters exchanged. The kidnappers, in their nightmare hand, would make demands of Christian, who would answer by posting a reply in the personals section of a newspaper. Several attempts by Christian to negotiate, claiming he didn't have the money, or even asking for proof of life, were ignored by the kidnappers. Finally, it was arranged that Christian was to ride on a train and throw a briefcase full of ransom money to a flag-waving, lantern-bearing man standing somewhere along the track. Only, the man never appeared. It turns out that day, a newspaper had misprinted that Christian was going elsewhere, and the kidnappers didn't even bother showing up at the train. Their final attempt at meeting, after 23 letters, came in November, with a random hotel in New York to be used as a drop-off point. The money was never collected, possibly due to the number of undercover police waiting in the lobby. After this, the Ross family never heard from the kidnappers again. But it's not the last the kidnappers were ever heard of. December 14th, 1874, 2 a.m. An alarm had woken Mr. Van Brunt. He knew what it meant. His neighbour, who was also his brother, a Supreme Court judge, had installed a burglar alarm telegraph on his summer home, an alarm that had just rung out. Someone was in the house. The alerted Van Brunt brunted into action, and calling to his son and 2 staff, said, "Now, boys, we have work to do, and must understand each other. We must capture these fellows if we can without killing them. But if they resist, we will have to defend ourselves." The latter was to be the option for the morning. The pair of burglars fired at the group, and the group shot back. After a short firefight, the burglars were laid out, riddled with shot, while the Van Brunt crew remained uninjured. One of the would-be burglars was dead, while the other was well on his way to joining him. Perhaps knowing this, he started talking. "Men, I won't lie to you. My name is Joseph Douglas, and the man over there is William Mosher. It's no use lying now. Mosher and I stole Charlie Ross from Germantown." The self-confessed kidnapper, Joseph, told those gathered how they had taken the boy as an easy way to make money. But when pressed on where Charlie was, all Joseph could say was that William Mosher was the leader, and only he knew where the boy was. They should ask him if they wanted to know. Only William was already dead. "God help his poor wife and family," was all Joseph could say when told of his partner's demise, passing away shortly after himself. Despite spending the rest of their lives searching, Christian and Sarah Ross would never find Charlie. Hundreds of fakes would present themselves over the years, claiming to be their long-lost son, while hundreds more would offer up clues, or claim they could track him down. For a fee, of course. It was even rumoured that he had been smuggled to Australia. 60 years later, in 1934, a man claimed to be Charlie, and even had the courts recognise him legally as the lost child. But he was never acknowledged by the surviving Ross family. And decades later, a DNA test would prove that he had been a fake. To this day, Charlie's disappearance remains a mystery. At the time, a song was penned about Charlie, called "Bring Back Our Darling." But unsurprisingly, a song from 1875 isn't on Spotify today. Instead, the pairing for this story will be "Sweetie Little Jean" by Cage the Elephant, which opens with "Sweetie Little Jean, where did you go? Everyone's been searching high and low." Wednesday, July 2nd. On this day, not year, Medusa gets stuck. Continuing on with our sea disasters named after Greek mythology, prior we saw the Titan add 5 to the Titanic's victims, and this week we'll look at La Méduse, or the Medusa. Medusa, the ship, was launched in 1810, alongside her 3 sister ships, at the height of the Napoleonic Wars, a Pallas-class frigate. She was 46 metres, or 154 feet long, and carried between 40 to 46 guns, and just shy of 2,000 square metres, or 21,000 feet of sail. She had barely been in the fleet 5 years, when, as the historian's Aber noted, my, at Waterloo, Napoleon did surrender. And with that act in 1815, the Napoleonic Wars came to an end. With the Bourbons back as rulers and King Louis XVIII on the throne, France went off to regain their lost colonies. First stop was Senegal, South Africa. The Medusa had been given to royalist Hugues du Roy de Chamareix to captain, with the goal of transporting Senegal's new governor, Julien Désiré Schmaltz, along with his family and a host of other passengers. Chamareix had experience in this role, being captain of a transport ship before. But that was before the war, and over 2 decades ago. As the 400-odd crew and passengers of the Medusa soon found out, captaining was not a lot like riding a bike. Chamareix made constant mistakes that not only the seasoned crew noticed, but even the passengers were able to see. Perhaps this was due to a newer model ship and his not being in charge of a vessel for 2 decades. Or maybe the reports that he had taken a mistress and, as per a 1948 Daily Mirror article, he was content to spend most of the time in his cabin with her and a supply of choice wines. Whatever the reason, one of the passengers, Mr. Richefort, an amateur navigator and member of the Philanthropic Society, offered up his services. Chamareix was more than happy to palm off responsibilities, but Richefort was somehow even worse than the good captain. This ship of fools concluded July 2nd, 1816, when, skirting close to the African coast, rather than from a safe distance to avoid reefs and sandbars, the ship found itself in shallow water and ran aground. The Medusa was stuck, 50 kilometers from the shore and already at high tide, meaning any hope of floating off on the tide was washed away. The next couple of days were spent trying to save the boat, realizing it was doomed, loading the lifeboats, realizing they didn't have enough, and then constructing a raft. La Machine, as the raft came to be known, was 20 meters by 7 meters, or 66 by 23 feet. It had no real means of propulsion, no rooms, and was largely just crisscrossed sections of timber with large gaps looking through to the ocean. The idea was for the 6 lifeboats to tow the raft along behind them, and as such, ropes were tied between the boats and raft. July 5th, amid fears the Medusa was breaking apart, the lifeboats were hastily boarded. 250 men and women rushed for the safety of the boats, while Governor Schmaltz was supposedly seated comfortably aboard one in his armchair. Some of the boats were overloaded, while others refused to take on more. Those remaining on board were forced onto La Machine, the raft, and found that after only a few had boarded, it started to sink. To make room for everyone, and to keep the raft afloat, everything had to be thrown away. In the end, the 146 men and 1 woman aboard the raft only had a bag of ship's biscuits, 2 barrels of water, and 6 casks of wine between them. And the biscuits had been drenched in water first, so were a salty mush. 17 chose to remain aboard the Medusa, and as a quick aside, they were eventually rescued. After 52 days, with only 3 survivors remaining. Everyone else set off, and it wasn't long before the boat started to feel burdened by the cumbersome raft, so they cut it loose. For 4 days the raft floated adrift. The food lasted 1 day. Fights between the survivors were common, with the sailors and passengers forming an alliance against the soldiers. During these clashes, the remaining water barrels were lost, and a lot of the wine was consumed, driving the sides to greater violence as they grew drunker. Stormy weather threatened to sink the raft, and the safe positions near the centre became highly sought after. Between accidental deaths, suicides, injuries, and murder, only 67 of the initial 147 remained. With the rations gone, those left turned their hands to fishing, or at least tried to. The fish weren't biting, so the survivors found something else to eat. The custom of the sea, as per Wikipedia, was practiced by the officers and crews of ships and boats in the open sea. Of those customs, one was cannibalism. Historian A.W. Brian Simpson stating, "Survivors who had followed the custom could have a certain professional pride in a job well done. There was nothing to hide." So, the remaining 67 turned to their fallen and said, "Dig in." Thin slices of flesh were hung up on lines to dry and cure in the sun and salt air, making a kind of human jerky. Shortly after, a school of small fish jumped over the raft, many landing on it, as they were caught and thrown in barrels. They were cooked over a small pile of gunpowder that had remained on board, but, as per one of the survivors, it wasn't enough. "Our hunger was so great, and our portion of fish so small, that we added to it some human flesh, which dressing rendered less disgusting." More days passed, and although the food situation had improved, for those that could stomach it, this wouldn't last long. And after 8 days, the number of survivors was down to 27. This, too, wouldn't last long. Owing to the previous skirmishes on board, the violent exodus from the Medusa, and the general conditions on the raft, a number of survivors had been left barely clinging to that term. Broken legs, head wounds, gashes, and other injuries. 12 of the remaining 27 were out of action, and in an environment where every extra mouth to feed was killing the chances for the whole to survive, a terrible decision was made. To quote a 1946 newspaper, "They were thrown to the sharks." And then there were 15. While the meagre rations and daily swig of wine would see these 15 live for a while longer, they were still on borrowed time. A day passed, then another, then 3. The rations were drawing down to their last. Another day gone. Finally, on the 17th of July, after 13 days adrift, they were spotted by another ship. It was one from the original convoy to Senegal. The remaining 15 men, the woman had been one of those thrown to the sharks, were saved, although 5 wouldn't survive the journey back to land. Of the original 147 that made it to the machine, only 10 had survived. Meanwhile, the captain and governor had easily made it to Senegal in their well-stocked lifeboats and were living quite happily. A report from some of the surviving crew was leaked to a newspaper, which did lead to Captain Chamarret being sentenced to 3 years in jail. Rather than a singular song for my pairing today, I'll be recommending an entire album. And get ready for this. Rather than music, it's an album of poetry. Rime of the Ancient Mariner, read by Richard Burton. Originally written by Samuel Taylor Coleridge in 1798, a little earlier than when our story takes place. It tells the tale of a suffering mariner, alone and adrift on a wide, wide sea. Thursday, July 3rd. On this day, not year, an American gaslight. Aviophobia, or aerophobia, as per sydneyphobiaclinic.com.au, is a specific phobia characterized by an irrational and persistent fear of flying or air travel. As a quick aside, I would like to point out that this Australian-based website spells characterized with a Z. For shame. But I digress. One of the things that can trigger such a phobia is the lack of control you have on a plane. You're told where to sit, when you can stand, and worst of all, no decision you make has any impact on the flight. In a car, for one example, you have direct control over a lot of what happens, with many believing they could outdrive any external disasters. One study found that 77% of Australian men felt they were better drivers than the average. Quite a contradictory number. The truth is, as a passenger, when flying, you really don't have a lot of control, and accidents do happen. Just look at some of the headlines from 2025 alone. Air India investigators probing whether deadly crash that killed 260 was sabotage. Toronto plane crash. At least 18 injured as Delta jet flips upside down during landing. Light aircraft crashes at tourist hotspot in Australia, killing 3. Metal drummer dies in private jet crash in San Diego. WKW.com, Indiana-based injury attorneys that, going by their staff banner, have never bothered with an affirmative action hire, list some of the common causes of a plane crash. Human errors in aviation, mistakes by crew members, air traffic controller negligence, improper aircraft maintenance, weather conditions, among a few others. Sometimes, however, the plane can be in perfect conditions, the crew and pilots make no mistakes, the weather perfectly clement, and still result in a crash, much like with our story today. The year is 1988, and Iran Air Flight 655 was on its way from Mehrabad International Airport in Tehran, Iran, flying to the Dubai International Airport. They had just had a stopover in the Bandar Abbas International Airport and a 27-minute delay due to an issue with a passenger's passport. On board the A300-B2-203 Airbus were 274 passengers, 66 of which were children, and 16 crew. Flying the plane this day was Captain Mohsen Rezayan, with over 7,000 hours flight time, which, to translate into 9-to-5 speak, was about 2.5 years flying experience. So, 27 minutes late, Air Flight 655 starts its 28-minute flight across the Persian Gulf to the Dubai International Airport. Unbeknownst to all on board the plane, down below, a tense situation was heating up. Without going into the full complexities of the event, mostly because I don't know them, Iran and their geographical neighbour, Iraq, were in year 8 of a rather bloody conflict. One of the fronts the war boiled down to was bubbling crude. Oil, that is. Black gold. Texas tea. Both countries were selling, and with each litre sold, it would help fund their side of the war. So, oil tankers were targeted, and as a third of the world's oil moves through the Persian Gulf, prices got a bit shaky. The United States donned their world police hats, which irked Iran all the more due to their history with the CIA mucking about in their politics years prior. So, early morning on July 3rd, 1988, Iranian gunboats, known as bog hammers, had been harassing ships in the Gulf, taking shots at US helicopters, and were ultimately chased back to Iranian waters by the 9,600-ton warship, the USS Vincennes. Chasing after the boghammers, the Vincennes opened fire on them. It was during this battle that they started picking up an approaching aircraft on radar. It was showing as a hostile fighter jet, and the Vincennes attempted to hail it 11 times, wanting it to alter course. 7 warnings were sent on a military frequency, and 4 over a distress one. They didn't get a response back, and ultimately the captain of the Vincennes, William C. Rogers III, ordered 2 SM-2MR surface-to-air missiles fired. 21 seconds later, they had impacted their target, the Iranian fighter jet, as crew aboard the Vincennes let out a cheer. In reality, there had been no fighter jet. The 7 hails over a military frequency went unanswered, as the plane they were hailing wasn't military. It didn't answer the 4 hails over the distress band either, as they were directed at a fighter jet travelling at a different speed. Besides, Air Flight 655 was travelling in the correct air corridor for civilian flight, and was broadcasting the correct IFF signal highlighting they were a civilian craft. None of this mattered to the million-dollar missiles. All 290 on board the plane were killed. All 66 children. The 16 passengers on their way to a wedding. The captain and crew who had flown the same route multiple times. Even the poor sod who had held up the plane just 8 minutes ago. As soon as it became public knowledge just what America had shot down, the gaslighting began. President Reagan stated, "I am saddened to report that it appears that any proper defensive action by the USS Vincennes this morning in the Persian Gulf, an Iranian airliner was shot down over the Strait of Hormuz." American allies jumped to the defense. A New York Times headline reading, "Britain regrets jet tragedy and backs the US account," while the Canberra Times demonstrated some mental gymnastics by posting, "It may seem ironic, but the United States deserves the world's sympathy over the shooting down of an Iranian airliner." Italy, with a nearby warship, jumped up to back the US version of events too. But just what was the United States claiming? Well, they rushed out a press release stating that Air Flight 655 had been outside of the corridor for civilian air traffic, had been descending at the USS Vincennes, had been broadcasting an enemy IFF signal, and not responding to any radio hails. All of this was either a lie or very misleading. They also failed to mention that the USS Vincennes had chased the gunboats into Iranian waters, and it too was firmly in those waters when it committed the war crime. To this day, America has never admitted full error in this tragedy, although they did pay Iran $61.8 million to be distributed to the families of the victims. Dance While the Sky Crashes Down by Jason Webley is my pairing for this story. Friday, July 4th. On this day, not year, an Italian-American-Mexican dish is served. Pop quiz. What dish does the following recipe make? Romaine lettuce, croutons, in a dressing of egg yolks, olive oil, Parmigiano Reggiano, lemon or lime juice, Worcestershire sauce, anchovies, and mustard. If you answered a Caesar salad, close but no cigar. The original Caesar salad contained no anchovies or mustard. To help out the next time you're asked this question, which I'm sure you'll be sooner or later, let's take a quick look back at the creation of this dish. Fortunately, we don't have to go back to ancient Rome for the origins. While some mistake it for a Julius Caesar creation, it was a much more recent Italian that birthed this dish. Well, I say more recent, but only comparatively so. Caesar Cardini was born February 24th, 1896, in Baveno, Italy, a small town in Italy's north, with fewer than 5,000 residents as of 2001. 3 of his 5 brothers had moved to America and Mexico to open up restaurants or hotels, with Caesar following shortly after. boarding the RMS Olympic, which is Titanic's sister ship, and arriving in America in 1913. By 1919, he was running a restaurant in Sacramento, but then something changed in America. Something we've talked about previously. Prohibition. From 1920 to 1933, America had outlawed alcohol, which led to the whole Judgment of Paris in episode 19, and also the 50,000 deaths in episode 21. Being both an Italian and in the restaurant business, Caesar did the only thing he possibly could. Moved to Mexico. Caesar's restaurant was opened in Tijuana, Mexico, a city just south of the US border, and saw a lot of American tourists during Prohibition. It was due to this patronage that on July 4th, 1924, celebrating Independence Day, not the movie, the restaurant had just about served all of their stocked food. Yet, hungry customers continued to come, and Caesar wasn't going to let them leave that way. Rummaging around the kitchen, he found enough ingredients to create a finger salad, something to be eaten with the hands rather than a fork. The idea being to pick up the long, slender lettuce leaves by their stem and eat them top down, sort of like a healthy pizza? So, taking the lettuce, olive oil, cheese, Worcestershire sauce, lime juice, egg yolk, and toasted bread, the salad was prepared, tableside, in front of the customer. Or, to quote Wikipedia, the dramatic flair of tableside tossing by the chef, which I think is a different kind of tossed salad these days, but I digress. Caesar was able to not only serve up something tasty for the hungry patrons, but also create a lasting dish. It not only lasted, but thrived. By 1947, the salad had immigrated to California and along the western coast of America. Gladwin Hill, head of the Los Angeles New York Times office, was quoted as saying, "The Californian institution that draws more oohs and ahs from Eastern visitors these days than anything in the travel ads is a salad," stating that the Caesar has been extolled by many consumers as possibly the greatest advance in salad fabrication in several centuries. California became so associated with the Caesar salad that many assumed it had been invented there. A 1951 newspaper writing of California, they originated the Caesar salad, which had become popular throughout the country. California wasn't the only one to attempt to claim the origins. In a move that likely left Caesar quipping, "Eh tu?" his brother, Alex, laid claim to inventing it. Alex's version was named Aviator Salad, after the number of pilots crossing the border during Prohibition to get their fix. Caesar Cardini would eventually pass away in 1946, but over 100 years after its creation, his salad lives on. While the restaurant where he created it has changed hands over the years, and suffered a number of ups and downs, the current owners continue to offer a tableside Caesar salad. While not a perfect description of the salad, and more likely a metaphor for mental health, my song pairing for this story comes from the television show Frasier, with tossed salads and scrambled eggs, with a more lounge jazz version sung by Lisa Sanchez. Saturday, July 5th. On this day, not year, have you got anything without spam? The second food story this week. George A. Hormel, born 1860, started a meat packing company in 1891. This new company would go on to become Hormel Foods, which grew from just George to having over 20,000 employees by 2024. While its range has increased over the years, and some fields have diversified, at its heart it remains a meat-packing company, of which its most well-known product is Spam. The origins of the name is a mystery. The person who coined it, Ken Daigneau, won $100 for the name, but the reason he called it that wasn't ever shared with the public. Still, since its July 5th, 1937 introduction, many have speculated on the name. The two most common theories being that it stands for spiced ham, despite the only spices, at a stretch of that term, being salt and sugar. And the other theory is it's a backronym of shoulder of pork and ham. But the M coming from the final letter of the word seems like it's a bit of a stretch. I should describe Spam for any listener that hasn't actually seen it before. It starts life, as the backronym states, as a shoulder of pork and other pieces of ham. The cuts in the 1930s that weren't finding much love among consumers. Rather than letting it all go to waste, the meat is ground down, mixed with salt, sugar, water, and sodium nitrite. The last ingredient helps preserve the final product and prevent any stomach-churning bacteria from forming. This mix is poured into rounded rectangular cans, sealed in, and cooked to preserve and further sterilize the product. All of this gives it a shelf life of 2 to 5 years. Although, and I advise against this, technically that 2 to 5 is just a best before, and theoretically, if stored correctly, even years after it should be safe to consume. And people do consume the stuff. A 1990s study found Americans consumed 3.8 cans of Spam per second. That's just as an average, mind, not per citizen. It isn't just Americans consuming either. During World War II, Spam became part of the soldiers' rations, with 100 million cans shipped off, and locals of areas the Americans were stationed got a taste for the tinned meat too. Hawaii, which only became an American state in 1959, consumed the most Spam per person of any state, with 5 cans per person each year. Currently, specially branded Lilo and Stitch cans are on sale too, so maybe Spam is space alien meat. In South Korea, it is gifted during the Lunar New Year. It's part of a popular breakfast in the Philippines, while Japan even had a Spam and cheeseburger at Burger King for a while. If you can remember all the way back to episode 1, you may recall I mentioned 2 lawsuits, the YMCA vs. the Village People, and Aqua vs. Mattel. Spam and Hormel have their own pop culture lawsuit too. 1996 saw the Jim Henson Company release Muppet Treasure Island, a retelling of the classic Robert Louis Stevenson novel, but with Muppet characters and Tim Curry for good measure. One section of the movie has native boar Muppets worshipping a washed-up Miss Piggy, the lawsuit taking offence at the name of the boar chieftain, Spam, claiming the movie has intentionally portrayed the Spam character to be evil in porcine form. They also objected to the character appearing in Happy Meals as a toy. The case was dismissed by the judge who quipped, "One might think Hormel would welcome the association with a genuine source of pork." Before we close out this story, a little peek behind the curtains. A lot of research I do for this podcast is searching newspaper archives for, hopefully, contemporary reports on the subject. One of the websites I use is trove.nla.com.au, which archives many Australian newspapers. Normally, they are a great resource for information. Not for this story. Whatever program they use for digitizing text for searching through has one key problem. It kept confusing the word spam for Spain, probably due to how closely the IN resembles an M. While frustrating for research, it led to some excellent accidental headlines and queries. For example, France anxious about spam. Spam firm on peace offer. And turbulent spam in movies. Not only the second food story, but also the second appearance of a Monty Python song. If you know their catalogue at all, I'm sure you know what song I'm pairing with this story. The Spam Song. Sunday, July 6th. On this day, not year, Georgia is without guidance. Maintain humanity under 500 million in perpetual balance with nature. Guide reproduction wisely, improving fitness and diversity. Unite humanity with a living new language. Rule passion, faith, tradition, and all things with tempered reason. Protect people and nations with fair laws and just courts. Let all nations rule internally, resolving external disputes in a world court. Avoid petty laws and useless officials. Balance personal rights with social duties. Prize truth, beauty, love, seeking harmony with the infinite. Be not a cancer on the earth. Leave room for nature. Leave room for nature. These are the messages, inscribed in 5-meter or 16 feet tall granite slabs that appeared in a field in Elbert County, Georgia, United States, on a morning in March 1980. The messages are repeated on 4 granite slabs, weighing in at 107,840 kilograms, or 237,746 pounds, in 8 languages: English, Spanish, Swahili, Hindi, Hebrew, Arabic, Chinese, and Russian. Much about what came to be called the Georgia Guidestones, or America's Stonehenge, was unknown. The man who commissioned the piece went by the alias Robert C. Christian, but what his real name was, who he represented, and why the Guidestones were made remain a mystery. The only statement they made when the stones were unveiled was, "We believe our precepts are sound, and they must stand on their own merits." For decades after, the stones became a tourist destination, but also became much more. Many were under the belief that the stones and their message were satanic in nature, calling them the 10 Commandments of the Antichrist. Others pushed the conspiracy theory that they were related to the New World Order movement. They were a frequent target of vandalism and graffiti, all of which came to a head on July 6, 2022. Just before 4 a.m., a silver sedan approaches the stones. Moments later, an explosion rocked the area, waking residents as the car sped away. A bomb had been detonated at the base of one of the granite slabs. In particular, the slab inscribed with the Swahili and Hindi translations. The car and the bomber have never been found, and their reasons for the destruction remain unknown. The remaining granite slabs were deemed structurally unsound and were removed. While the town originally had planned to rebuild the structure, that outcome is now unlikely. Wayne Mullenix, whose land was sold off to the mysterious Robert of the Guidestones, stated of their destruction, I was disappointed to think that somebody would go to the extreme to destroy something that has not hurt anybody, one way or the other, for 42 years. The song I'm pairing with this story is Commandments by Causey Way. While not about the Georgia Guidestone specifically, the line of, "We couldn't follow 10 commandments," definitely rings true for the 10 messages the Guidestones were promoting. Avoid useless officials being particularly pertinent these days. Which brings us to the end of the week, but not the end of the episode. For we have the quiz. So, pens and papers at the ready, and here we go. Question 1 for Monday. What book did I reference at the start and end of this story? Question 2 for Tuesday. How much did the kidnappers want for Charlie Ross? Question 3 for Wednesday. 147 made it onto the raft, but how many of that number were women? Question 4 for Thursday. What were the Iranian gunboats called? Question 5 for Friday. While Caesar has the credit, what did his brother name his salad? Question 6 for Saturday. What country did the newspaper archive rename to Spam? Question 7 for Sunday. Maintain humanity under how many million in perpetual balance with nature? Right, you got something down for each of them? If not, feel free to skip back a few seconds and listen again. But if you're good to go, here we go. Answer 1 for Monday. The book referenced was Rendezvous with Rama. Answer 2 for Tuesday. The kidnappers wanted $20,000. Answer 3 for Wednesday. Just one woman, who ultimately didn't survive La Machine. Answer 4 for Thursday. The Iranian gunboats are known as bog hammers. Answer 5 for Friday. Alex made the aviator salad. Answer 6 for Saturday. The country that was renamed to Spam was Spain. And answer 7 for Sunday. Maintain humanity under 500 million in perpetual balance with nature. Which brings us to the end of the episode. If you've enjoyed what you've listened to, and are feeling particularly extroverted today, I'd love if you could share this podcast with friends, family, colleagues, anyone you think may enjoy my particular take on history. Or, if sharing isn't your particular form of caring, I'd also be very appreciative if you could rate the podcast on your app of choice. If I've made any horrible mistakes that you can't abide not correcting, I can be reached on thisday.notyear@gmail.com. Join me again next week as we look back at the week of July 7th to July 13th. Until then, I hope you have an historic week. Bye.